age of 25 and witnessed the Battle of Dien Bien Phu.
When Dien Bien Phu started, it was top secret, of course. We were let in on the secret and we were parachuted in. A photographer and a filmmaker were chosen to jump with the first wave. We were unarmed and we had to run for it because we came across some Viet Minh. So we frantically raced across the rice fields, and believe me, when it hasn't been cut, rice is hard to get through. The beginning of March saw the start of 57 days of battle, during which shells fell every minute. We were constantly being bombarded. We covered the events as well as we could, and we had our photos sent out along with the wounded.
France, wearied of all the bloodshed in Dien Bien Phu, it signed the peace agreement on May 8, 1954, and retreated from Indochina. Vietnam brandished the victory flag. In June 1950, when war in Korea broke out, David Douglas Duncan was in Japan writing an article on Japanese art. The former war photographer who had been with the Marines in the Pacific reached the front 3 days later. In sub-zero temperatures and despite being ambushed by the Chinese, Duncan followed the Marines on foot for 130 kilometers as they retreated from the dam of Tianjin to the American lines by the Sea of Japan. In October 1956, Budapest rose up against the Soviets. Jean-Pierre Pedrazini had been sent to Hungary to cover his first war. He saved the life of a young boy before being shot at by a tank. He saw his last ever report from his hospital bed. The 60s were a carefree time. War was a taboo subject. However, despite the censorship, certain photographers tried to alert the public as to what was going on close to home. Claude Azoulay, for example, was sent to Bizout to cover a brief but violent war. Then there was Algeria, a long conflict that photographers had trouble covering because no one ever knew where the next confrontation would be. Azoulay, who grew up in North Africa in a country at war, lived through 20 conflicts over a period of 40 years.
There are secret wars, wars that don't get photographed much. The war in Algeria remained fairly hidden. It didn't get much coverage because we were reluctant to be a part of this war. The war in Indochina was similar in a way, but the photographs taken during the Vietnam War brought the American people closer to war.
Photography evolved with the Vietnam War. The explosion of press photography shocked readers by revealing the violence of the war. This war, which was supposed to be brief, dragged on hopelessly. The American Larry Burroughs, a correspondent for Life magazine, covered Vietnam for 9 years. His photos are crude and cruel. Burroughs wanted to persuade people in the West that there was a great human tragedy going on. The photographs had a clear political agenda. The color pictures accentuated the reality to the detriment of the artistic side. Life said that only his pictures conveyed the color of blood.
This is Sabre 6, over. Roger, Sabre 6, we've observed a column of vehicles that are stopped 2 miles.
He covered the whole war alongside the soldiers and died in a helicopter operation like this one.
Find out if this is an Arvin roadblock or Viet Cong, over.
The The Englishman Don McCullen devoted almost 25 years of his life to war reporting and took an impressive series of photos of the Tet Offensive in 1968. His pictures portray the awful conditions in which civilians suffered or died and helped to sway public opinion.
Photography during the Vietnam War played an official role in maintaining the war effort, but ultimately, I think it served to demonstrate the atrocity of war. In fact, out of all the images of war, the photo that stands out for me is Marc Ribou's photo showing a woman with a rose facing up to the soldiers with their bayonets at Kent State University. I think that photo helped to end the war. I think it's a decisive, historic photo. There haven't been many like that in the history of war.
It's become an absolute necessity for photographers to cover wars. In Lebanon, it's no longer a question of choosing sides or defending a cause. Photographers portray the tragic destiny of Beirut, a city in ruins. Ireland has its terrible civil war, a religious war which uses real bullets as well as rubber bullets, water cannons, and tear gas.
We can't get engaged personally because it's too difficult to photograph. If we were to become personally engaged in the conflict, we would never get our work done. It's with newspapers, we have deadlines to meet. We've got to process our films there, and we've got to wire them. So we have all these problems, and to be engaged with one side or the other, it just wouldn't work. For that reason, it can become difficult, because loyalists would know that I am from the South and I'm a nationalist. However, we have to do our job.
The complexity of local or religious conflicts means that photographers cannot defend their ideals. They're interested in the victims. That's the only cause worth standing up for.
As a photographer, if you attempt to take images to protect all the innocent people, and there are guilty people on all sides, so it makes it easier that way to feel for everybody. My interest is in life and the human condition, and unfortunately, since I started since '89, the world condition has really deteriorated, and that's what I've chosen to push my efforts into.
I think that the violent, brutal faces seen in wars will certainly go down as some of the great moments of photography. Some photographers produce their best work in times of war. This was clearly true of Robert Capa during the Spanish Civil War. War and photography form a tragically steadfast pair.
War reporters are a credit to the photographic profession. Some died on the front line covering the news. Some suffered physical injury. But the living too left their youth, their illusions, and a little of their soul on the battlefields. An army of ghosts are here by our side. What did the ancients know of their great men? Just faces in profile on coins. They could only see reflections of their faces. Printing them on paper marked the start of the modern age. Photography was invented in 1839. Soon after, portrait studios sprang up in England and the United States. The dream became a reality. But what do our faces say? What do they reveal? In 1843, David Hill, a painter from Edinburgh, visited Adamson's calotype studio and suggested a partnership that was due to last until Adamson's death in 1848 at the age of 27. Charles Dodgson, better known as Lewis Carroll, author and mathematician, was fascinated by children. He wrote Alice in Wonderland for Alice Liddell, the daughter of one of his friends, and made her one of his first models. He photographed a few celebrities, but young girls were his favorite subject, and portrait photography was his passion.
Portraiture is one of the ways in which photography began. In other words, that the camera was used very widely before the invention of photography as a means of recording the likeness of a person. Before the invention of photography, there was a huge fascination in Europe with silhouettes. So photography really began, partly at least, as a way of making likenesses of people.
At the age of 48, Julia Margaret Cameron took up photography. Her peers criticized her lack of technique. "My only wish is to record all the beauty I come across," she replied.
In the 19th century, with photographic portraiture, it does perform a very similar function. Otherwise, it shows the social position of the person photographed, and that person would often be photographed in a way which reflected their power, their influence, their prestige. People wanted to send portraits of themselves to loved ones. In an age when perhaps there were more arranged marriages, people also wanted to pass around portraits. So life was perhaps also a bit shorter for most people then. Babies died, children often died, very high infant mortality rates, quite high mortality rates in Europe generally. So there was a fascination with keeping a record of what somebody looked like, as a way, if you like, of remembering them.
Cameron strove to attain the dramatic intensity of old paintings. By the mid-19th century, portrait photography became more widespread. Professional studios sprang up, the most popular of which was that of Disdéry, who, for a modest sum, offered a portrait-cum calling card. All the studios tried to attract the more well-off customers. For instance, Nadar moved to the prestigious Boulevard des Capucines. He invented the psychological portrait photograph. He talked to the subject, generally a friend, then suddenly interrupted the conversation when he thought that the subject had the right attitude. His aim was to show the individual's character rather than his mere identity. Great men of the day considered it essential to have their photograph taken. Etienne Carjat, a friend and rival of Nadar, also rejected any kind of decor or backdrop and photographed a gallery of contemporary celebrities. In 1900 appeared the first work of a photographer who's known as the greatest portraitist of the century, Edward Steichen.
I brought out my portfolio with fear and trembling, and Rhoda looked at it and seemed to be very much interested, said some nice things about them, and so I turned to him with great gusto and enthusiasm. I said, "The greatest ambition of my life, Master, is to make a photograph of you." And he put his hand on my shoulder and turned to Fritz and said, "You see, Fritz, enthusiasm isn't dead yet in this world," which was very nice, and I can just hear it today yet.
Count Maeterlinck, the Belgian symbolist playwright, wrote of him, "The sun has revealed to us his ability to make portraits of objects and beings faster and more precisely than the pen. But today, it seems that reason has found a flaw through which it can penetrate the mystery of this nameless force and encourage it to say things that have not yet been expressed in the twilight world of grace, beauty, and truth."
He began as an artistic photographer. A friend of Stieglitz's, part of the pictorialist movement of the late 19th century, making very strong, very powerful symbolist imagery in the pictorialist mode. A lot of manipulation in the image, done by chromate, brushed photographs, and then became an advertising photographer in the 1920s and changed his style completely towards the new modernist influenced, very hard-edged, very precise, very objective sort of imagery.
Garbo came in off the set. The director says, "Now you have only 5 minutes." I said, "All right." So I had a kitchen chair there for her to sit on. I draped my black fricassee cloth over the back. I asked her to sit on that chair. She sat on the chair, and like a good sport, she straddled the chair, leaned her arm on the back, facing me. And then I started the photograph, and she would turn her head this way and shake her head in this way. And this wasn't the Garbo that I was interested in. This was the regular Hollywood Garbo. So I said, "It's too bad we have to photograph all these things with the hairdo that you wear in the thing, this Hollywood hairdo." She said, "Oh, this hair," put her hand up to her head and brushed them back. And I said, "Greta, now let's make a photograph of that." And the good sport again that she was, she went into it, and those are the only pictures I have ever used of Greta Garbo. Long ago came to the conclusion that if you could get one moment of reality shining out of that person, that was as much as you could get in the portrait, and then you had something essential.
The dynamism of the interwar years combined with the birth of the cinema's mythical figures provoked a new interest in portrait photography. In the 1930s in the United States, the Hollywood studios sought to lionize their stars. The watchwords were glamour and mystery in the pursuit of the absolute dream, the artificial paradise of seduction. In France, portrait photography exploded in the late 40s, the most famous example being Harcourt Studios. The critic, Roland Barthes, went as far as to say, "In France, you're not an actor until you've been photographed by Harcourt." In their pantheon of stars, the characters were all photographed with the same camera angle and the same lighting. The set photographer Roger Corbeau photographed 160 movies, many of which are now considered classics. He imposed his own style, not hesitating to modify scenery and lighting to serve his own artistic universe. Brassai arrived in Paris from Hungary during the Surrealistic Revolution, but he maintained that he only sought to express reality, for nothing is more surreal.
All this talk of naturalness and posing is rather strange, in my opinion. To me, it's a cliché, because when the photographer photographs you, the natural thing is for him to look at you and what you're doing. When he says, "Just pretend I'm not here," that's a joke, isn't it? When you look into a camera, it's almost like sculpture. You turn into a statue. That, to me, is what portrait photography is about.
Brassai photographed Parisian nightlife before turning to Paris by day, but his concern was always to portray atmospheres and magical moments with sincerity. There are days, Robert Doisneau said, when the simple act of seeing is sheer joy. Even though he arranged certain scenes, Doisneau liked to define himself as a gatherer of images. He isolated fragments of time in banal situations in which daily life seemed to be freed from its shackles. It's true, he added, that I sometimes borrowed the hidden treasure that my peers unknowingly possessed, which admittedly made things easier for me.
You get in position and wait for people to appear in the little black box. It happens all by itself. I was born in the slums of the suburbs. As a child, I was already aware of their ugliness. The suburbs are currently undergoing big changes. A new ugliness is replacing the old ugliness. But to me, the people there are very beautiful in these idiotic surroundings.
The importance of portraiture can be seen also in the nature of the mass media, in the nature of the press, in that virtually every aspect of the press, whatever the story is, people want to personalize that story.
In the 60s, a trend that stemmed from the magazines created a new need: naturalism. The tabloid press wanted to reflect the society of the day and show famous people as they were in everyday life. Photographers were interested in the stars, but now they also created them. The studios no longer controlled their subjects, and the paparazzi's zoom lenses made their appearance. The age of famous people was beginning. It was a stroke of luck for Willie Rizzo, the man who loved women.
A newspaper photographer has an appointment at a certain time, and he has to come up with the talent at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, say, because there are photos to take. He takes the photos and rushes them over to the paper. He can't do the shoot again. The photos have to be good, that's all there is to it. You can't say, oh, such and such a thing didn't work, I wasn't feeling well, I was tired, I got to bed late. That is out of the question.
Philip Halsman arrived in the United States, his reputation already established. His photos of celebrities were on the front pages of countless newspapers. He was to do over 100 front-page photos for Life magazine. For Claude Azoulay, taking photos of famous people was easy work. He photographed the stars during the carefree years of the booming economy.
What is very interesting about the portrait is that it's always been used for a variety of purposes. I mean, it has a social meaning, it has an economic meaning, it has a political meaning. All of those aspects are in play. The portraits of celebrities, of the famous, the powerful, would also be quite widely distributed, quite widely shown, and would have an influence on the ways other people photographed ordinary individuals. So there would be fashions in portraiture.
Politicians also let themselves be photographed. They realized the importance of photography because it brought them closer to the general public. In doing so, they appeared more accessible, more human. In this photo, Churchill looks like a determined warmonger. In actual fact, he's just sulking because Karsh had taken his cigar away. Yusuf Karsh is a master political portraitist and respects the tradition of the posed portrait. He composes his photos with an obsessive concern for lighting and claims that the secret of a good portrait cannot be explained. Another posed portrait by Seydou Keita, whose photos form a historical overview of Malian society. They correspond exactly to his subject's desire to be photographed with their finest possessions to look as good as possible. To Seydou Keita, photography is art, and art is beauty. Many portrait photographers in New York come from Harper's Bazaar and Vogue. Famous for his perfectionism, Irving Penn introduced a distance between himself and the subjects. He observes them but does not wish to know them. He always photographs them against a uniform, gray background without any special effects. Richard Avedon sees photography as a confrontation. He creates a tension to seize the model's inner truth. Photographic portraits are the image of people who know they're being photographed, according to Avedon. And this knowledge is as much part of the photo as their clothes or expressions.
Portraiture is performance because it seems to imply some kind of lie that conceals the real truth about the sitter, but that's not all. It goes much further than that. The fact is that you can never get at the thing itself, the real nature of the sitter, by stripping away the surface. You can only get beyond the surface by working with the surface. All that you can do is manipulate that surface, gesture, costume, expression, radically and correctly.
In work, I look for something in a face, and what I look for is contradiction. Complexity, things that are contradictory and at the same time connected.
Portraits should be lively, and nothing should distract you from their vision. The same neutral backgrounds as those in the fashion world should be used, enabling the viewer to concentrate on the subject.
As one who's addicted to white backgrounds, it seems odd to me that a gray or tonal background is never described as an empty background. It's so hard with a white background not to let the graphic element take over, to keep it humanistic. It's so hard to give emotional content to something so completely graphic and potentially caricatural, dominated by the hard, unyielding edge. And that, of course, is the challenge and importance of it. It prevents everyone, the artist, the viewer, and the sitter, from using a person's chosen environment, their house, their library, their comfortable chair, as a means of understanding them. If you can make it work successfully, it permits people to become symbolic of themselves.
If these were one of the Stalin portraits, if you were going to die tomorrow morning, do you think you would do anything differently? Why don't you just think that that's what's going to happen?
Avedon's portraits capture the model's mystery and emotion. His perception of photography is similar to his perception of the world, the wounds of time, the wait for death, the obsessions. And despite all that, the only redeeming thing, the ability to give life. If Helmut Newton is more at home in fashion and nude photography, where he can let loose his fantasies and obsessions, he puts the viewer off scent by mixing classicism and humor in his portraits. He confronts the subject with his own universe and instills his photos with his imagination. According to Jean-Louis Sieff, photography only shows external appearances. A face can look sad to one person, bored to another, and calm to a third. To interpret an image, we all draw upon our own imagination, our memories, and tastes. A third style between tradition and modernity appeared in the 80s. Peggy Sirota's style is simple and unpretentious. She likes photos which evoke a feeling of freedom. In addition to her fashion and advertising work, she's done portraits of all the Hollywood stars, attempting to see them with a fresh eye. She attributes this creativity to her lack of technical knowledge and only aims to do one thing in her work: provoke emotions. Dominique Isserman started taking photographs during the shooting of Jean-Luc Godard's films. She then moved into fashion and advertising and became one of the best-loved photographers to the world's biggest public figures. Bettina Reims was famous for her fashion and advertising work before embarking on a more personal project, treating women's deep, hidden violence.
What I like about photography is that things are never what they seem to be.
Bettina Reims plays with the duality of life, masculine and feminine, tenderness and harshness. Her series on androgynous people was deliberately ambiguous.
I leave a lot of room for spontaneity in a photo shoot. Sometimes people cry or laugh, do things they don't really want to do. But when I photograph stars, I don't do much of that now, but when I do, the stars have the right to choose which photos can be published. So there's a kind of impunity in a photo session, because they know they can go too far, and then they can censor certain pictures afterwards, which can be very frustrating for me.
Patrick de Marchelier doesn't aim for any effect of style or decor. His photographs of the Princess of Wales show her the way we'll always think of her.
When I shoot a portrait, for me, it's more going for the moment with the person. It's really about the inner quality of somebody and their inner soul. It's what you try to bring out of that person and the trust that you set up. With the Dalai Lama, I had 10 minutes in a hotel room once, and it was a great rapport. Madonna I might have for 2 days doing many, many pictures. But the interesting thing is letting that person be themselves and realizing in very few moments that you have to have that rapport and go for a moment and go for a photograph. So to me, with a portrait, it's important that the person is allowed to come through in the photograph.
Anton Corbijn took his first photos at a concert with his father's camera. He then took portraits of artists for the top magazines. He conceives the photographs in terms of music. As a creator of advertising pictures, video clips, and graphics, he's constantly looking for new, more complete solutions, characteristic of the new generation's passion for multimedia. François-Marie Bagné began by drawing. He showed his work to Dali, who was so enthusiastic that they became friends. The young prodigy was 15 years old at the time. 4 years later, he published his first novel, Résidence Secondaire, which established his reputation in the literary world. His third gift is photography. His portraits are chance encounters or arranged events which treat the themes of love, solitude, and the passing of time.
J'ai d'abord pris des photographies. I first took photographs to remember unforgettable things and faces that I was afraid would fade away. I don't have a good memory for faces. In the street, for example, when I see a man standing on his own, screaming, his arms raised in despair, his despair feels like my own despair. I can't just let it go, and once I'm back home, write about it, at the corner of the Rue Royale and the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré. That's ridiculous. Writing about it is idiotic. To me, writing is good enough for poor souls like me, whereas photography is unique.
I think that a portrait should be powerful enough to make us want to ask questions about the face we're looking at. Something in the contradictions in the face, in the attitude, and the expressions should make you wonder who this person really is and come up with answers of your own. To me, a portrait is like a huge neon question mark.
Get ready, models, the mask is about to fall. The portraitist, sculptor of your faces, lets others see the texture of your skin up close, lets their eyes look into yours, and search the wrinkles of your inner self. And yet, thanks to these portraits, be they the fruit of chance or design, what a delight to exist forever. The first photo reporters were assigned to take pictures which served as models for the drawings and engravings that will illustrate an event. Photojournalism was born when an image or a photo piece would suffice to tell a story. Picture plus caption equals news. Photo reporters were both adventurers and witnesses to everyday events, globetrotters searching for just the right image to help people understand, and if need be, to expose facts. Jules Itier, present at the signing of the 1,000-year treaty between France and China, unknowingly became the first photo reporter. Roger Fenton, sent by Queen Victoria to Balaclava, photographed the Crimean War but carefully masked the death and horror there. Photographers were present when the West was won, offering tremendous material on these unexplored territories. These photographers, scenic pioneers, provided a mythical viewpoint and were mainly concerned about the aesthetics of their pictures. The plates they used were large and their equipment was bulky and heavy. When the first transcontinental railroad was built, the courageous photographers were part of the survey expeditions, revealing a world of adventure to the general public.
The people who were producing the early work were conscious that they were producing important artwork. It was very carefully produced. They were using techniques which were well known to artists at the time in terms of composition and work like that. They were very attentive to composition. They were very attentive to what they put into the image.
Exploring the South Pole meant danger. Scott's entire crew died on their return journey. The photographs were found with the frozen bodies the following autumn. On the Shackleton expedition, the ship Endurance was trapped for 10 months on an ice pack and was eventually crushed by the pressure during the spring thaw. The photographer had no qualms about jumping into the icy waters to save some of his glass plates. Eugène Atget meticulously took inventory of everything he found interesting in a cold, still, almost abstract world. In 1897, he began a series of photographs on the street vendors and the art of old Paris. His work gained recognition in the U.S. while he was alive, thanks to the American photographer Bernice Abbott, assistant to Man Ray, who was a neighbor in Rue Campagne Première. But Atget still died in poverty. Alfred Stieglitz had a love affair with New York, never tiring of photographing the city. He advocated the familiar day-to-day scenes. Determined to defend a new art of photography, he formed a society called Photo Secession, whose quarterly publication, Camera Work, was first published in 1903. He wanted to define photography with its own criteria as opposed to painting. Stieglitz would later say about this shot taken on an immigrant ship, "If all my work were lost and this photograph was all that remained, that would be fine." Jacob Riis was the first to delve into the wretched poverty of city life. His book, How the Other Half Lives, described New York's neighborhoods, and he also received the backing of then Police Commissioner Theodore Roosevelt for well-needed social reforms. Like Riis, Hein, a sociologist, was also indifferent to photography as an art form. He used his camera to produce evidence and expose many social injustices, namely child labor. He also shot those who were building America, the men at work, later explaining, "I also wanted to do two things, show what needed to be corrected and show what needed to be admired." In the same spirit, Dorothea Lange devoted her career to social reporting. Deeply marked by the 1929 economic slump, she wanted to publicize the plight of the Great Depression's victims. In 1935, she began working for the Farm Security Administration, created by Roosevelt under the New Deal. Her project was to objectively record the living and working conditions in rural America. Her photographs were intended to arouse public opinion to support the government's action. The subject in her modern style of reporting touched the heart and spurred people into action. The depression, which followed the collapse of the Wall Street stock market, eventually led to worldwide economic decline. Nonetheless, photo reporting was booming, thanks to newspapers and magazines which offered images of an endangered world. Photo agencies were founded to supply the media. These agencies circulated the pictures and managed the photographers.
Keystone was one of the first international press agencies. A Hungarian came up with the idea for the agency and photo services from the United States after World War I. He had two brothers, and they split up the world photo production market.
The Garay brothers founded Keystone Paris and modeled it after their agencies in New York, London, and Berlin. The photo reporters did not sign their work. Every shot was stamped Keystone. The modern illustrated magazine was born in Germany. Pictures alone could tell a story, and the photographers were no longer anonymous. Eric Solomon, pioneer of the candid political picture, caught celebrities and heads of state in unguarded moments. Aristide Briand nicknamed him Dr. Mephistopheles because of his two tufts of graying hair. Fellow photographer Eisenstadt is considered the father of photojournalism.
Eisenstadt really invented, along with his colleague Salomon, what's called in American candid photography. In other words, the photography of people in everyday life settings. He really brought that technique very much to the fore, and of course was extremely well known for certain images, such as the American sailor kissing the girl on VJ Day in Times Square. But these are classic images of candid photography, a photography which says we will treat every subject, whether it be a prime minister or whether it be a hobo, a drunk or a tramp in the street, with the same approach.
There's a love story between Paris and photographers.
Hungarian André Kertész, forerunner of the 35mm format, took pictures with humanity and tenderness.
In Paris, everything is true. Everything is human. and everything fits. There's no acting. Everything is natural. I was born to take pictures. I didn't want to imitate engravings or paintings, because I felt that the essence of photography is totally different, like another art form.
Every photographer in the world wants to come to Paris on a trip and then take pictures of life here, or of some corner or other in this city. Such incredible wealth. And thanks to the people who fell in love with Paris, this is probably the only capital in the world that has 150 years of photographic history.
I arrived in 1928. Then, maybe 4 or 5 years afterwards, somebody lent me a camera, and I started taking pictures at night. The nightlife fascinated me, and I wanted to capture things then. And later I published my first book called Paris at Night. This secret world of Paris attracted me enormously at that time. I photographed all walks of life, but it was very hard because you had to be accepted first.
Paris accepted Brassai, who moved in surrealist circles and lived the bohemian life with Henry Miller. He said that Brassai was a living eye. Henri Cartier-Bresson, who began his career snapping spontaneous shots for Vue and Harper's Bazaar, believed that everything had photographic value. His technique was like the dance of a bee who, stirred by fragrances, buzzed around the nectar.
I think photography means putting the eye, the head, and the heart in the same line of sight. Time is essential for me. You see a particular thing at a particular moment. When you want something, that thing will happen. You get it one way or another. You have to think all the time, except when you're taking pictures. It's about intuition. Honestly, you're overcome with joy over a particular subject, visual joy.
Cartier-Bresson frees the visual subtleties in a scene and concentrates on the sidelines of an event, whether it's the first paid vacation or the coronation of George VI of England.
What you get is the rise of what's often called humanism. In other words, a concern, a fascination with the everyday life of ordinary people, both in the same society and in other parts of the world. And that explains part of the fascination with 35mm photography, I think. It's the ability to photograph very rapidly and without any complication at all.
Cartier-Bresson pulls swing-wing, perfect images out of his Leica, decisive instants that he tries to explain, but in fact he can't, and he knows it. It's talent and possibly even genius. In 1947, he created a cooperative of photographers called Magnum with Kappa, Seymour, and Roger. For them, photo reporting was a religion. Kappa emphasized his militancy and posed as a journalist in shots as intense and masculine as he was.
I met Kappa in North Africa and in Italy during World War II. And we discussed, and he gave to me his idea of finally forming an agency where we would be our own bosses, because we were all fed up with being told what to do by editorial directors. In 1947, when finally the Magnum Photos was formed in New York, and then I was one of the 5 founder members, because Kappa knew of my work in Africa and the Middle East. And we, at the very beginning, divided the world between the 4 of us photographically, because Bill Van der Voort had dropped out. And I had Africa and the Middle East, and Henri had the Far East and India. Shim had Europe, and I think Kappa was ambassador at large or something like that.
1954, Cartier-Bresson was the first Western photographer to be allowed into the Soviet Union. Each image was a revelation as a once closed world finally opened up. He attended Gandhi's funeral and called himself a Buddhist angry with the state of the world.
Photography is like drawing. My way of keeping a diary. Basically, if there weren't a need to communicate, to show people what you like or don't like, testify about our era, I'd have just as much fun if there weren't any film in the camera. The exciting part for me is when I'm right in front of a subject. Click. That's overpowering. Click. And I press just at the right moment. It happens in a fraction of a second, and that's the only creative moment there is.
For the first time, photographers who were photojournalists saw that somebody could produce extraordinary images of extraordinary artistic quality. This influence has gone on until the present day. I mean, I think he is still by far the most influential photographer of the 20th century.
In the optimistic post-war years, some publications were revived and others were born. This was the heyday of photo reporting. There was a growing need to circulate information, and photographs meant truth, impact, and modernness. From then on, every event had its pictures. In 1959, when the Cuban Revolution broke out, Daniel Camus, international reporter at Paris Match magazine, was honeymooning in the Caribbean.
We were in Cuba covering the event. Nobody could get in because the airport was closed. We were the only reporters over there. We were able to meet Castro, who arrived in Cuba with his bearded group, his whole team. He welcomed us warmly and even gave us a revolution as a wedding present.
When you're photographing something, you have to be in tune with the subject and like what you do, or else you'll never take great pictures. If you think about how much money you'll make from the picture you're taking, you may take a good one, but it will not have been your heart guiding your head.
Alberto Corda worked in fashion before turning to photojournalism. He first became interested in the living conditions of Cuba's underprivileged neighborhoods and then struck up a friendship with the revolutionaries and became their favorite photographer.
Antoine de Saint-Exupéry wrote a marvelous book called The Little Prince. In it, there's a sentence that goes something like, "You can only see properly with your heart. The essentials are invisible to the eyes." That's what happened to me with Che Guevara. I was taking pictures. Fidel Castro was giving a speech in the street, and in a sweeping movement photographers typically make, Che Guevara came into my viewfinder. I pushed the release button and click, it went off. Without my brain telling me what to do, it was an eye, mind, and heart sequence. I got 2 pictures of Che Guevara because he appeared out of the blue, took a look at the crowd, got emotional, and left. That's how I got the most famous image in the history of photography in 1/250th of a second.
When the Wall of Shame was built, television cameras were there, but photographs continued to write history. The major news event in 1964 was the Pope's visit to the Holy Land. Paris Match chartered a Caravelle jet and sent 60 reporters to cover the story. The plane was turned into a news office, and they radioed information back to the magazine headquarters at Orly Airport. The magazine photographers were present at every stage of the historical journey and were able to capture the slightest gesture, immortalize the slightest holy moment, and they shut out the other magazine crews who learned a hard lesson: event, mobilization, and speed. In May 1968, the riots were widely followed on the radio. Magazines and newspapers were also there to tell the story with the help of photographers and amateurs. In the 60s, time seemed to speed up. Television took off and became the leading news source. It had such an impact because it could broadcast an event live, and viewers felt they were actually living it. It was time for the photo reporter profession to evolve. They could better observe the world's major issues that now spilled over into screening rooms, books, and exhibitions.
It was a good thing that television came along, but that photography stayed where it was, not getting too important, staying simple, but yet very powerful and very personal. Sometimes it was like a weapon, but also a testimony, something very oblivious, subjective, mental, I guess you'd say.
You can write history with photography. When you have photographers who don't sell their work right away, it doesn't matter. They'll sell them later. The pictures always end up appearing somewhere because a page in history is written every hour of the day, somewhere in the world.
Photographs, like symbols, chronicle history, and aesthetics are often as important as the news piece. While moving TV images go by too fast, photographs, like words, stay imprinted in people's minds.
Sometimes I see CNN, in places I work. These people stay on the surface, and it's like very quick sort of news. So I think there's going to be always in the future a place for us, where we can really penetrate the culture and deliver something different than a quick soundbite, which you get on the TV.
Brazilian Sebastião Salgado was an economist until the day he realized that the pictures he brought back from his missions in Africa better illustrated the situation than his written research. This passionate humanist wanted to invest in the long term. Author of a 6-year-long saga about human beings at work, The Hand of Humankind, men and women will always be at the heart of his research. In his opinion, his pictorial coverage must be totally sincere and almost reverent.
I discovered photography very late, and when I did, I thought it was a fabulous way of connecting with people, getting close to them, to see problems from the inside. I thought I could offer insight and provoke a much wider debate through the images rather than economics.
For the year 2000, Salgado is researching migratory movements and displaced populations, whether due to armed conflicts or social problems. He believes such movements of populations are leading to a universal race.
This is the map of the farm where the peasants are supposed to live. The 205,000 acres are not being used. A movement of landless people perfectly illustrates how people are displaced from rural areas to the cities. Most people that are already here in this camp aren't really from this region. They've been moved from a lot of places. They came here looking for land because they don't want to go to the cities. This issue is an integral part of my research because today we are witnessing huge masses of people moving from the countryside to the cities. When you take a picture, there's the desire to do it, but you take along your past, your ideology and your history. My pictures don't take shape the minute I press the button. They've been with me ever since I was little. The lighting I'm interested in is what I've seen all my life. Maybe it's the huge backlighting because I come from a country where there's light everywhere. We were always in the shadows. I know how to look from the shadows into the light.
All year long, magazines commission Sébastien Salgado to publish stories with 40 to 60 pictures in each piece.
You live in France, you're in Paris, but there are actually few people that really live like this. I think 4/5 of the planet lives in an entirely different way. Life is very hard, rough, the environment is not easy, there's overpopulation and people have to fight to survive. This is where I came from and this is my country. To do this kind of story, you have to strongly identify with the subjects you're taking. You really have to be in total agreement ideologically with what's happening, and then there's a very, very intense involvement with the photographer. I think what happened in Africa, in Rwanda, when a tremendous number of photographers came, lots of cameramen, at one point people started criticizing the photographers because they took the pictures. But I heard very few people criticizing the government and the people who committed the massacres. The photographers were not responsible. They were there to witness, to record. They brought back testimonies through their images. They initiated debate and controversy. People learned about this conflict because photographers brought pictures back from over there.
To all photo reporters, you nomads, intense and free, you enrich our lives not with things the way they could or should be, but the way they are. You give us your worldly intelligence, your distress, your despair, as well as your sense of humor, your battles, and your light. According to Yves Saint Laurent, fashion photography is the living, sophisticated spark of a certain moment in time frozen forever. It's more than just a means of selling clothes. It crystallizes the tastes and aspirations of an era. In the beginning, fashion photography was indistinguishable from the designs. A century later, however, the clothing is often just a pretext for some forms of artistic photography. Before photography was used in the press, fashion was the sole realm of the designers.
The first photos were in the 50s. In other words, it came along with haute couture. And once the bourgeoisie, with their extremely important social status in banking and commerce, chose to portray themselves as the aristocracy had done in the 18th century, images changed from being pictorial to photographic.
À ce moment-là, elle devient photographique.
The Countess of Castiglione, a figurehead of the Second Empire, wanted to be portrayed in her clothes and costumes. Louis Pierson photographed her for a quarter of a century. Les Modes was the first magazine to publish a large number of photos. The models were usually show business stars. After theater and music, Studio Rüttlinger was attracted to the fashion world. The photos were taken in the same conditions as the portrait, which was the first vocation of the studio, founded in 1850. At the turn of the century, the Seeberger brothers took the first exterior fashion photos. Jules, Louis, and Henri scored the elegant side of Paris and the horse races to give fashion a dynamic image.
When she saw the quality and composition of these photos, Madame de Broutel, who ran a magazine called La Mode Pratique, asked Jules to take some fashion photographs in public places, such as at the racetrack or the smart set out walking on the Champs-Élysées or in the Bois de Boulogne, and to do a feature on the clothes of the rich and the aristocrats, which could be used to illustrate articles on fashion.
Photography is a family affair for the Seebergers. The children learned it from their parents. Later, they took over from them, taking photographs for the top fashion magazines. Adolphe de Meyer frequented and photographed the aristocracy before turning exclusively to fashion photography.
Fashion photography was no longer documentary. Fashion photography was no longer promotional. Fashion photography was now documentary, promotional, and artistic.
Baron de Meyer's photographs were first published in Vogue in 1914. He used light to interpret clothing. When he became head of Vogue's photographic department, he made the use of backlighting de rigueur. But his misty style soon no longer suited the magazine, which had always wanted to be at the forefront of fashion. In 1923, he left Vogue to join their rival, Harper's Bazaar. Meanwhile, Edward Steichen took over Vogue's studio in New York. He abandoned Baron de Meyer's hazy style and imposed a more robust, composed style. In the 30s, Harper's Bazaar, run by Carmel Snow and art director Alexei Brodovich, renewed the genre. By grasping the instantaneity of movement, Munkacsy introduced the basis of contemporary fashion photography. He gave American women a dynamic modern image. The clothes became lively and an integral part of the model's personality.
An art director is there really to aid communication between the various people present at a photo shoot. It requires a lot of preparation beforehand. And his role in a magazine is to provide the right mix between the photographer's different subjects and styles.
In 1934, Horst replaced Huenengen Huene, his mentor and friend, at the head of the Parisian studios of Vogue. He was inspired by his classical style, his ancient Greek themes, but added a touch of humor and refinement. He used accessories and decor to give the clothes a sensitivity, a playful, sometimes theatrical dimension. His conception of fashion was in phase with the superficial desires of the interwar years. The Second World War put fashion photography on hold. Photographers could not ignore the material situation, and women adapted and adopted more functional clothes. Immediately after the war, the magazine Elle was full of practical advice and advocated resourcefulness. In the 40s and 50s, New York became the fashion capital for photography, particularly thanks to Irving Penn. After several years at Harper's Bazaar, Penn met Alexander Liberman, Vogue's art director, an encounter that proved decisive. He was hired by him in 1943. Irving Penn instilled his photos with his personal vision of fashion. His compositions are extremely pure. The clothes are evoked more than represented.
Some images were so significant, particularly photos by Irving Penn, with silhouettes that were so exaggerated, so precise that when I saw the clothes in real life, I was disappointed, because they weren't as silhouetted, as beautiful, because of all the techniques and tricks of photography. You can play with the clothes, exaggerate the silhouette, perfect the pose, to make the leg look more slender, and so on. There are lots of things you can do with photography to accentuate and sublimate the lines and silhouettes. So I was a little disappointed when I saw the reality because I was addicted to the images.
The photography fed the fashion, and the fashion fed the photography. And it was all influenced by music and film and England and, you know, whatever was going on then. I think the photography, and once it's seen in the magazines, ups the level of the fashion, and then everyone's more and more aware of fashion.
I learned about fashion through photography. I didn't study fashion. I looked at the magazines and I saw photos by some very good and some not so good photographers. And so my whole fashion culture is visual, from television and fashion photos.
Sometimes a photographer's personality is so strong that it triumphs over trends and taboos. This was the case with Helmut Newton. For him, fashion was not an end, just a means of provoking and expressing his own vision.
I'm inspired by the cinema and by paparazzi photos that I find extraordinary. I think the paparazzi's approach is really amazing.
The women in Newton's photos are often dominant, always independent. Fashion is generally associated with sex, money, and seduction, and expresses the photographer's obsessions and fantasies. Fetishism, perversion, and the failings of contemporary society are pinpointed in a universe of luxury, which is necessary to the expression of desire.
I have certain obsessions, I think, about women, among other things. I photograph a certain social class. I'm not Cartier-Bresson. I don't portray real life. It's a life which is real, but which is recreated.
In the 70s, Paris became the mecca of fashion again. French Vogue gave photographers unparalleled freedom. Alongside Helmut Newton, Guy Bourdin was the star photographer. Sex and violence are an integral part of his photographs. Bourdin is inspired by the atmosphere of crime reports, but his aesthetic sense relies heavily on makeup. His photos for Jourdan shoes made him famous and marked a turning point in advertising photography. The product lost all functional value in a composition which aimed to take it out of its usual context and give it its own existence. Bourdin has shocked right-thinking people, but has always managed to apply his personal vision to his commissioned work. Fashion photographers in the 80s had to deal with a new phenomenon. Their models were stars.
Photographers choose their models because they are inspired by them. They have a precise idea of what they want to use them for. So it's more a case of inspiration. It's not calculating. The photographer thinks of himself first. A chief editor could say, I really like, I'm a really big fan of that girl and I'd like to work with her. But she never has the final word on who gets chosen. The photographer does. As he's the one behind the camera, he's the one who has to be inspired. He acts on his instincts and has the final say.
After 10 years in front of the camera as a model, Ellen von Unworth coordinated the Guess Jeans advertising campaign, which really launched both her and Claudia Schiffer. The photographer's eye is sexy, intimate, and exuberant. Patrick de Marchelier symbolizes today's trends, emphasis on the models and simplicity of composition. His photos exude a healthy atmosphere. Jean-Baptiste Mondino was the precursor to a new generation of photographers. As a graphic designer, art director, director of advertising films and video clips, and designer of record sleeves, he makes full use of the latest technologies. Color is used to give a positive idea of fashion and provides women with liberated rather than sophisticated models. Another protege of the Vogue stable, the Peruvian Mario Testino, loves women who are sure of themselves.
There's a return to a classical style, to certain surefire values. Maybe it's because there are so many uncertain things in the world. We're not even certain of being able to go out into the street, so we're trying to cling to things which have a degree of certainty about them, and I try to reflect that in an elegance which can be timeless.
If clothing has pride of place in Mario Testino's photographs, he's constantly navigating between his use of black and white, well-mannered classicism, and more modern colors. His photos contain an incredible amount of energy, according to Madonna, and an extraordinary sensual quality, according to Gucci couturier Tom Ford. Dominique Isserman successfully switches between fashion, advertising, and video clips. Her sophisticated photos have made her a favorite with many top bands who give her a free hand. Peter Lindbergh grew up in West Germany between a bank of the industrialized River Rhine and another covered with trees. The memory of this childhood world is still fresh in his mind, and he's always preferred to make use of contrast. His work is often associated with certain models and fashion designers. Lindbergh believes in body language, nature, and emotions, and he gives his black and white photos a very cinematic feel. His preferred technique is using different nuances of gray.
I don't think fashion photography necessarily has to be trendy or something that's of the moment. I mean, the clothes very well could be, but I think when I tend to do a photograph, I like to make a photograph with the fashion being part of the whole picture. It isn't just about the clothes or how they look. To me, it's important that it works as a story or a photographic essay, or the picture will hopefully hold up over time. You know, it used to be where a photograph was about just showing the clothes, but more and more, sometimes it's about the mystery of it.
You know, it's a challenge, you know, everything's a challenge. Your fingernails, everything. End up with the jaws? Yeah. Yeah, you got it. You're doing great. Amazing. Head back there.
David LaChapelle lived in New York during the 80s, and he portrayed the damage caused by AIDS and drugs. Everyone started wearing black, and that's all there is now. At times, it feels like we're all in mourning, he said. As a reaction against this, LaChapelle preaches the use of shocking pink. He insists on the fact that he's a photographer and not a computer scientist, so he finds it more fun to photograph real life than create on a computer.
If you cross a certain boundary, then it's no longer valid in fashion. Like if it's ugly or if it's vulgar, then it loses its credit, you know, and people don't take it seriously. Yeah. They just write it off. So there's a very thin line between beauty and edge. You have to show the clothes because it is a fashion photograph, but beyond that, they give you so much freedom.
Wow, fantastic double. Fantastic. Oui.
Clothes for me are still life. I've always seen the material as a still life, be it different kinds of cloths, embroidery, the sheen of silk, or the matte look of cotton. Only a woman's skin to me is living skin.
Because he's been taking photographs of fashion and beauty for so long, Tien knows all about the importance of the clothing, and he magnifies it, often to the detriment of the model. Tien does not hesitate to crop off faces or concealing them in shadow. Everything must help to sublimate the material and the colors in a space where fixedness and movement alternate.
I think that clothes are the most important thing in a fashion photograph, and the model is just a part of the whole, for me anyway. I don't need a celebrity to wear a couturier's dress. I don't like mixing things. When there are too many celebrities in a photo, it becomes a weekend magazine. When I photograph a dress for a publicity shot, it's almost a way of correcting my work. It lets me see my own work as a fashion designer with an objective eye. I can see the good and the bad. I see what I shouldn't have done, where I went wrong. In a photo, things can be corrected which can't be on the catwalk. So it's very interesting. It lets me stay in touch with fashion all year long. Otherwise, I just do my collections and go on vacation the rest of the year, like certain other people, which would bother me a lot.
Boosted by the success of his photographs for Chanel, Karl Lagerfeld has been able to give his creativity and talent a free rein. Inspired by Oskar Schlemmer, a German sculptor and painter from the 20s, Lagerfeld chose to have his models pose in Schlemmer's fantastic abstract costumes. Clothing is a pretext for a dreamlike composition which is closer to painting than formal fashion.
The biggest problem is to invent the present. You invent the present by being simple and clear, not by trying to copy another photographer, but perhaps by being inspired by an idea. Photographers who stick to what their predecessors did make wonderful pastiches, but they don't take things forward at all. Whereas photographers who embark on a new idea, on a new, obsessive way of looking at things, are the ones who really fully develop their talent.
Richard Avedon subscribes to this school of thought. For more than 50 years, he's brought new energy to photography. In 1945, he presented his portfolio to Alexei Brodovich, art director at Harper's Bazaar, who became his mentor. 20 years later, Vogue headhunted him. His presentation of fashion is simple, almost classical. The apparent spontaneity of his model is precisely orchestrated. If the neutral backgrounds are a recurrent theme, the compositions are often more complex, and if fashion is often a matter of style and era, when it's seen through Avedon's eyes, it's all about timelessness and personality.
His imagination is limitless, and he has a metaphorical vision of existence and an immediate understanding of people, added to which a perfect eye. In other words, the eye is more intelligent than the rest of the head. This ability to grasp things in a moment that other people don't see at all.
Avedon prefers the study of movement to narration. In this, he's a direct descendant of Martin Munkaczy, who was the first to shake up the fashion world. Avedon's genius is to combine movement with the static studio tradition. You can't freeze fashion any more than you can freeze time, and so the passing of time is an integral part of his work.
The ultimate expression of performance, extremely stylized and self-conscious behavior, is of course fashion. In fashion, everything, hair, makeup, is used to create a performance. So many portraits in the history of art are fashion portraits, fashion images, as are so many beautiful Klimts, Goya, Velázquez. All the court paintings are, in a sense, fashion portraits. Photographs are hallucinations. My photographs are my hallucinations, and like hallucinations, they are shot through with a surreal, erotic possibility. Erotic possibilities and death. Like all things hallucinatory, they are never far from the power of myth. And I have been surprised more than once by the power of my own unconscious.
Richard Avedon did a series called The Passerby of the Century for Egoist. Stephanie Seymour passes through a century of fashion photography without aging whatsoever. Avedon fuses fashion and the passing of time, life, and its procession of passersby. As he so eloquently put it, Fashion is not the short-lived reflection of elegance, it's the continuous sparkle of time.
Fashion is one of the richest expressions of human desires, ambitions, needs, frailty, insecurity, security. Yes, beautiful. What we wear is an indication of our sense of ourselves. It's a gift. Look what they're wearing in the Whistlers. And what they're wearing is fashion.
Fashion is a pretext for approaching a woman, stealing her body, penetrating her gaze, drinking in her quivering skin, her trembling leg, trying to breathe in some of her soul, be it perverse or innocent. Fashion is also a pretext for sculpting strange clothed statues who are longing to move, but who are frozen by the camera's shutter. Thanks to photography, fashion is more than fashion. It's a long, great moment of eternity.